Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about taking ownership of your career. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones with us to talk about taking ownership of your career. Welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Well, when we were talking about some ideas for this episode, we had a couple of different things in mind and kind of decided to combine them because they're related, although somewhat contradictory. And the first is that people really need to take responsibility for their own future career starting as law students. But the second idea is that you don't actually have to do everything on your own, and you shouldn't try. It takes a village, and there are lots of resources to help. So let's unpack those a little bit. What type of problems have you seen in your work with law students when they're not taking ownership of this process, or sometimes they're not even really taking ownership of their desired endpoint?
Well, I think first of all, a lot of times they end up somewhere that they don't want to be, and they don't know how they got there.
Right. I had someone once describe it to me actually in a recruiting interview at OCI as being like on a treadmill. And, you know, you just sort of get on that treadmill, and then before you know it, you've ended up, I mean, I guess if it's a treadmill, you're still at the same place. Maybe a better analogy would have been like one of those moving sidewalks at the airport. You know, yeah. you step on and suddenly you're like, wait, am I going to London? Wait, do I want to go to London? Maybe I'd rather go to Paris. But that's just where the sidewalk dropped you off. So that's where you get on the plane. You know, I think this happens a lot. Let's face it, with big law, you know, people end up in these jobs that they're pretty unsuited for and don't even necessarily want. Like recently we read who was it, Andrew Yang, the presidential candidate who I think lasted 5 months in his first big law job, well, only big law job. You know, you end up in these places where you don't really want to be.
And I do think that law school is sort of designed in a way to encourage you to get on, you know, that moving sidewalk or whatnot and keep going. And so I think that it can sort of be set up that way. And so I just encourage, you know, students to kind of take a step off and think about it. No matter what the people around you or the people at school are sort of encouraging you to do, you need to think about where you want to end up, because they're not the ones who are going to have to work in those jobs.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And different schools, you know, kind of are pointing you in different directions. And so one of the things when you're looking at schools is you can consider, well, what are the job prospects most typically from this school? Is this a place that seems to align with what I think maybe I want to do? You know, I mean, I went to a school that was kind of notorious as a big law factory. And shockingly enough, a huge percentage of the people who graduated ended up doing large firm work, even if they came in thinking they would do something different. So, you know, I mean, this is a perpetual problem, and different schools are doing different things. But I think it is worth really thinking about, you know, is this pointing me in a direction that I want to go?
Absolutely. And I think another issue that we definitely see with students is that they sort of expect that they go to law school, it'll all just be figured out for them. Like there's a process in place, there's OCI, they have career services. And so if they end up at the end of that process and they don't have a job, they feel really discouraged, bad about it, maybe a little bitter about it.
And I think,
yeah. And I think that, you know, it's not a process that's going to guarantee you a job, and no one's telling you that, or
right.
They shouldn't be.
Right. I mean, I think, you know, even in today's economy, which is much better than it was several years ago, but even now, I mean, firms are not hiring, you know, every single person at any school, really. Yeah, and, you know, we have podcasts on getting a job outside of OCI. Like that's a place that many people at every school where OCI is going on will be. And the reality is, you know, unfortunately, no one in career services has a magic wand that they can wave and provide you with a job. Like that's something that you may end up having to hustle for.
Yeah, I think they can help you. but they definitely can't just do it for you. And so I think I'm just encouraging people to kind of take some responsibility for what they want.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I've heard from my friends who are in career services, and it's frustrating for them if someone just shows up and says, well, I just want a job. I'm like, well, I can't really, it's harder for me to help you in that scenario. They're like, well, what kind, give me some direction here. Like, what do you actually want? And I don't think a lot of law students can really answer that.
And I think that is something to ask yourself in law school, because it's going to come up eventually. And so even if you get your first job outside of law school and that gets done through OCI, like at some point you're going to hit somewhere in your career where you're going to be faced with that question. So it's probably better earlier and get on a track that you're more interested in and happy about rather than later.
Right. And I think sometimes too, people get kind of panicked and they just start applying to anything without any real sense of whether this might be a good fit for them or whether they're particularly qualified or interested. And so as a result, okay, you sent out 200 applications, but it was everything from, trust and estate firms to public interest to tax law. And it's like, well, this is probably not the best application that's landed on someone's desk.
And I think it's going to get confusing when you're trying to sort through this and you have all these different stories,
different resumes.
This is what I really want to do. No, this is what I really want to do. And somehow it's not going to work.
Yeah. I mean, I think, taking ownership kind of means thinking in a real way about, what do I bring to the table? What is, what makes sense for me? What am I a good candidate for? And if you're not a great candidate for something that you do think you really want to do, that's fine. You just need to kind of own that and take steps to move in the direction of getting that experience, however that is, whether it's a class you take or, an internship or even some sort of paper you write, so that you can make yourself a legitimate candidate. But, if you're applying to 18 different types of firms and you've never taken classes in any of these, it's probably unlikely to work out that well.
Definitely. And I think it's something a lot of law students do. And I know that it can be difficult to figure this stuff out. And that's why I'm just encouraging everyone to, give it some thought.
Yeah. And we'll talk later about kind of the best way to do that. For me, I think another aspect of the sort of not taking ownership of the process is that oftentimes, and I think this might be because law students are kind of used to being, kind of told what to do and then achieving certain results based on that. But oftentimes people really fail to look outside of these standard channels and to really look for other job opportunities. So maybe, for example, they're only applying to stuff that their school sends to them. Well, everybody at your school got that job offer, got that posting. So you can probably assume other people are applying to that too, if it has any, if it's not a terrible opportunity. But maybe there are other places people could be looking. And I think if you kind of forget about how the rest of the world finds jobs, it can be, you're not really using the resources that you could be using.
Absolutely. And I encourage every law student, have you looked at your local bar association? Because I always think of that as like a place to start outside of school. And rarely does anyone say that they have. Right. So I think that's just an example of that should be the first place you look, what's related to the law in your city. Yeah.
And I think certain types of job candidates have a better idea of this. If you talk to someone who's interested in public interest or something, you'd say, well, have you looked at Indeed.com or whatever it is? And they're probably like, yes, I have. But beyond these kind of, really obvious places, I think most people are just kind of like, oh, well, I'm sure a job will show up in my inbox one day. And it's like, well, that's not really the way this typically works. You might have to go out and find these opportunities for yourself.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of effort, but I feel like it will pay off in the end if you do it kind of in a more kind of calculated, organized, thoughtful way.
Yeah, and if nothing else, as you mentioned, this job straight out of school is pretty unlikely to be the last job you're ever going to need to look for. So these are all just skills you can take forward in your career when you decide you didn't actually like that dream job that you found the first time out of school.
I can't think of anything we're talking about that would be a waste of time or not worth it, whether or not it gets you a job right now.
Very true. I think that's right. All right, well, let's shift gears to the second part of the question. So we've now just told everyone they have to do everything. No, not true. What about people who just absolutely refuse to get any help? What have you seen them kind of missing out on?
I think these people are sort of the other side of the same coin, a different way to think about things. But to me, this is the person who, like you say, have you opened up your network? Have you thought about who you know? And it's just like, I don't know any lawyers, sort of very specific in their thinking, and they only want to do it a certain way, and they don't want to put it out there. And I think there could be lots of reasons for this.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think a lot of this really comes down to kind of a mindset issue, so if almost it goes back to our very first podcast that Lee and I did about the growth versus the fixed mindset. So, if you're coming at it kind of a scarcity mindset, a rigidity mindset, like there's just one perfect job, you're competing in that zero-sum game, you have to get it, like other people are trying to prevent you from getting it, that's not really the case typically. So, if you come at it kind of from a more place of curiosity, openness, and strategic, but also flexible, because otherwise, if you're one of those people who's like, I will do this totally on my own, I will not accept help from anyone. Well, you're just missing opportunities. You're missing opportunities for possible job prospects. You're missing a chance to possibly become a stronger candidate. Developing some self-knowledge, maybe talking with people who know you about what you could be doing, or personality features or whatever it is, whether that's, a personal connection or even a coach or something like that. These things are going to actually help you move forward in your career. And frankly, in some cases, people who are failing at interviews and that kind of thing, like you need help to get better at them. Like you're just kind of making things harder for yourself than they need to be.
And that's why I think people in both of these categories can kind of end up in the same place, which is sort of stuck and not knowing how to move forward.
Right.
And, just kind of discouraged. And I think, both of these people can use help to kind of figure it out. And so I think it's about sort of taking initiative in both ways. And like you said, being more flexible, being more creative, all that.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, I know from my own personal experience, sometimes I feel like I kind of vacillate between these two sometimes if there's something I'm stuck on, so it's like, oh, well, I'm kind of overwhelmed about the idea of finding a job. So I don't really want to talk to anyone about it because that seems stressful. So I'm just going to figure it all out on my own, and I kind of go back and forth. And in the end, like don't necessarily end up making progress. So I haven't really taken any ownership of it and I haven't really done anything, but I'm also refusing to get help. So,
And we've all been there.
Yeah, and I feel like this is maybe not an uncommon viewpoint of the average law student. Like, you're under stress. You're maybe not in like the most perfect conditions for emotional intelligence. And you feel like there's all this pressure, but just vacillating between those two poles is unlikely to get you the results that you're looking for.
Definitely. And I think, though, there is a way out of it for both sets of people that to me is sort of a similar answer.
Right. What is that answer?
I think what I would encourage if you're in that place of being stuck, which is where I picture both of the people we're talking about, I would say make a list of some things you haven't done yet. Just like open yourself up to like, how would I get a job? Like what are some steps that I can do? Are there some people I can talk to? Look at my LinkedIn. That always seems like a good place to start to me. Mm-hmm. And I think we talked before about how everyone should have a LinkedIn and should have people on it.
So, hey, if you don't, that's a great place to start.
Yeah.
Super easy, 5 minutes, done.
Yep. And I think you'll find tons of people right away. So look at their networks. There may be people, who can help you and you didn't even realize. So I think just doing something that's different from what you've been doing, you can go to the library, get a book. I think it's a great place to start. Look in the career sort of self-help section.
Yeah. No, that was going to be my suggestion. I was like, get curious. Like you're in law school, do some research. And, I think this doesn't have to be like unfun. I think, hopefully for most people kind of learning more about yourself and thinking about what you really want can actually be enjoyable. Frankly, I think for a lot of people, depending on your family history, this might require some therapy if you really have no idea what you want. I think it was Brene Brown who talks about this a lot, about kind of, the people who end up in law school tend to be sort of perfectionist and very driven, very results oriented type people. And a lot of that actually comes probably from having like dysfunctional family dynamics when you were a kid, where you were expected to perform and do really well. And you don't actually at that point typically question like what you really actually want, because all you've done your whole life is be the teacher's pet and kind of perform and get A's. I mean, that's frankly how most people end up in law school. So this may actually require taking a step back and like really doing a deep dive and, kind of sitting with that idea of like, well, what do I want when it's not just people telling me what I should want?
Yeah, and I actually think all the stuff we're talking about is sort of taking a step back from like job applications, because I don't think that's a place to go when you're stuck sort of in the, logistics of all of that.
That's more like
applying.
That's kind of like strategies and tactics. We've already got some podcasts.
Exactly.
You can go listen to that. You're not at the point where you need tactics because you don't actually have a real goal yet. Yeah.
And I think you could have already, had a bunch of applications and you could have already done that. And then you're taking a step back and you'll go back to that. You can kind of vacillate. And I think what also happens is people get panicked about all of that stuff. And so they feel like taking a step back maybe is taking time away from that, but it's not. It's going to help you get to the goal. And I think it's much more useful and it's going to be more productive, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like, before you can figure out how to get to the end goal, you got to kind of really figure out why that even makes sense and what you're really looking for. A couple of books I liked. I like The Startup of You, which is kind of an interesting book by the founder of LinkedIn. I think anything by Brene Brown, who I've already mentioned, is super useful. Brene is kind of that helpful big sister type where you just sort of like, wow, I just want to listen to you talk more about how I don't have to be perfect. That sounds great, Brene. But I think, if you've never had that experience, then it's hard to say what you want until you've kind of sat with where you've ended up. Is that really where you want to be? I think Seth Godin's also really interesting typically. I mean, he's more kind of like the marketing and stuff, but any of these things, they're not specifically career books, but they're kind of about living and work and that kind of thing. I mean, you can also just kind of Google or go to a bookstore and pick up what seems most interesting. Like I found an interesting list we can link to on the Muse, which was, 21 books that will get you ahead at work. And there's some interesting stuff on that list. And so I think just following your curiosity is a good starting point for people who really just aren't sure, where they want to end up.
And I was going to say, if you're listening to this, you probably like podcasts. And there's tons of podcasts I think would be helpful too. There's one I've really liked called Without Fail that started this year. And it sort of talks about people in all different industries who are successful, but then it talks about kind of their biggest failures also. And it's such a range of people. And I think it's really interesting because some of the people you might not have even known, you think of them as a success and you don't know how they got there or what, big failures they've had. And everybody's had that. So it's sort of how you pick yourself up.
No, that sounds really interesting because I think sometimes people are afraid, what if I make the wrong choice? What if I get the wrong first job? Or what if I get a job and then I'm not good enough and I don't succeed in it? Or, what if this and what if that? And the reality is, these things are going to happen. You can't predict them. And there's, like I said earlier, I'm not sure there's one perfect job that you have to get or your life is over, which is also the mindset I think a lot of law students get into. If I don't get that clerkship, my life is just going to be terrible. And it's well, probably not. You'll probably find something else. Maybe you meet the love of your life in that second job and you live happily ever after. We just don't know.
Definitely. And I can think of lawyers who probably would not have been able to get the job they ended up with at the beginning because they didn't go to the law school where they would have recruited them from or,
I
all sorts
know
of
people
things.
like that. Absolutely.
And they're in the same place as everyone else.
Right. And typically they're happier in the end because they actually know that they hustled and that they really worked to get this job. And they know that, okay, if something happens, I'm not going to be just left out in the cold. I know how to do this. So again, you're developing these skills that can give you confidence later on.
Definitely. And I think we've also talked about some alternative jobs where you're not actually working as a lawyer. And, the JD Advantage jobs. And I think there are lots of great options there. And that might be a better fit for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, this is a great time to kind of start figuring out what you need to learn and start learning it, and also thinking about who you can reach out to. And then, as you made the point, start doing it. So we've done some podcasts on this, but I think certainly the baby steps approach here, done over time consistently, that's what's going to really help, and also hopefully get you out of that stuck feeling. If you can sort of look at your schedule and be like, okay, I said I was going to send out, whatever, 2 emails this week, and I haven't done that, and it's Friday, so I really need to do that.
Definitely. I mean, I think it's sort of like a diet. Like if you're trying to eat a certain way and you have a bad couple days, rather than just completely get off track and just say it's over,
right, done.
Why not just say tomorrow? Yeah. Why not just say tomorrow? No, I'm going to do something tomorrow.
Right. Like tomorrow,
I didn't, whatever.
Yeah. I'm going to exercise like 15 minutes. Like, okay, I'll start tomorrow. Yeah. I did an entering podcast recently with Stephanie Hanna, who has a company called The Other 85. And she talks a lot about developing kind of the social skills you need to succeed as a lawyer. Her point being, only about 15% of your success is really like that substantive matter. And that's an interesting one if people are sort of like, well, I don't know how to do this. She has some great ideas for just building your network in a way that feels authentic and isn't terrible. Because really, that's what we're talking about, and when you refuse to ask for help, I feel like you're also missing that opportunity to build relationships with people, because the reality is most people like to help you, and they're not going to think poorly. They're going to think better about you in the end.
Definitely. I mean, I think we all know that feeling where it does feel better sometimes for us to help other people than probably even what they're getting out of it.
Yeah, you're like, oh, wow, I'm so flattered. They want my help. Wow. They must think I'm really great.
Exactly. But I think a law student might look at it as you're busy, you're important, you probably don't have time for it. And you know what? If they don't, they won't do it. Right. They won't get back to you. They're not going to fit you in. But if they do it, it's probably because they want to help.
No, I got an email the other day from someone who's thinking about going to law school, and like they asked, they have kind of similarities in some of their background, and they're like, hey, I listened to your podcast. I thought that you would be like a really interesting person to help me kind of figure this out. Can we get coffee? And I'm like, yeah, you seem interesting. Like that was a polite, nice email. Like this is not a huge ask. Like why not?
And I think you'll probably get a good number of those if you reach out to people.
Yeah. I mean, if it's, again, like you kind of have to know what you're asking for and like why, in this case, this was a very specific targeted ask, and it made sense for me to talk to this person. It wasn't just like, hey, so I'm unhappy in my current job and I'm thinking maybe I should go to law school. Can we have coffee? I'd be like, no, I'm sorry. You need to go and like think about this for a while. But, I think asking for help, whether it's from like career services, like career coaches, even just friends or family who like doing this stuff. I mean, almost everyone probably has someone in their life who's always like the person that people want to talk to about like their career and things like that. No, I mean, I feel like I always have.
And I think I would suggest kind of doing it in the order of doing some of the self-work first, coming up with some kind of place to start with, and then come to somebody, because I think everyone is a little more inclined to help if they feel like you've done some of the work yourself first.
Oh, absolutely.
And you sort of have a direction. Because I think it can be hard, like for career services, when law students come to them with no idea.
Right. Like, I just want a job. Doing. It's like, okay, great. Would you like to go be a barista? Like, I think Starbucks is hiring. Oh no, that's not what I want. It's like, okay, then what do you want?
Yeah, just come up with some. It doesn't have to be one idea. It could be a few ideas, but I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, and I think you can always evaluate, how these ideas are going, and people shouldn't be afraid to make changes. So if you do get a job or an internship or whatever it is, I think it's always really important to actually evaluate how that experience is going. Is this really, sometimes people get so fixated on this idea that they have their dream job, like, oh, BigLaw is my dream job. And then they get there and they're actually kind of miserable, but they can't really admit that because it's their dream job. But, I think you've got to pay attention to really the details of how you like to work. Like, is this an environment that's comfortable for you? Do you like the other people? Is the work interesting? Is it the type of stuff that you want to be doing? Do you feel good about the clients you work for? Not just like, oh, I have my dream job, so now I have to stick with it.
Definitely. I think that's true. And I think I can see why people get stuck in these situations.
Oh, yeah.
For practical reasons, and also because it sort of maybe feels embarrassing to say, like, I made the wrong choice, or this isn't right for me. But like we've said, I think it's all going to lead you somewhere. So nothing's a waste.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are reasons, there are plenty of reasons to stay in a job you're not thrilled about. I was actually kind of impressed. I think this article I read, I think it was in the Washington Post about Ender Yang, it was kind of being circulated as like, wow, he's such a quitter. He left after 5 months. And I was like, actually, that's pretty impressive. Like, I mean, most people stick it out for like a couple of years being unhappy in big law. But I have to admire like the audacity of just being less than 6 months in and saying, you know what, this is not for me, and quitting with $100,000 in loan debt. I mean, I'm not sure, financially it was probably his best option, but like I admire the audacity.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for really knowing what works and doesn't work for you. And not everyone fits into those categories, but I think that's impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I read it as more of a positive. It's also funny because any lawyer who's worked in big law that I know, like no one is surprised by that article at all. But for people who are not lawyers, it's this moment of like, but what do you mean he quit this like job? He was making so much money and it was so prestigious and he was so lucky to have it. And every lawyer who's worked in big law is like, oh yeah, less than 6 months, man, more props to him,
Yeah. Like I always say, there's a reason they pay you that much right off the bat.
Exactly.
It's not just to be charitable.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not just because you're a smart person. It's because you're getting paid for your time, basically, which means you're going to be working a lot. And that, I mean, it is what it is. Like for some people, maybe that is their dream. But, I think being realistic, too, about what you're actually getting into and not just kind of buying into like, oh, it's so prestigious. But really looking at like the day to day of, how is this work environment functioning? I mean, for me, one of the things that was most challenging about being a firm lawyer was the lack of interactivity with other people. So I was in San Francisco, and you have these like open plan offices, and there are debates about whether that's good or bad, in tech companies and things. But in my law job, I had my own office, and I would go in and I would sit there and I would work. And like the average day, maybe I would talk to my secretary, chit chat for a few minutes, but it was very isolating, I found. And so for me, that was not an environment that was probably going to be conducive for me to do my best work for a long time.
But you had to do it in order to realize that.
Right, exactly. I never realized how much like collaboration and also like location independence mattered to me. Like I actually would have been happy working from home. It was just the fact that I had to be in this office that I really didn't like it.
Mm-hmm. And that's definitely something to keep in mind. What are the things where you work better or worse, all of that. And I think that's things you can lay out and try to see, okay, this job might be a better fit or not.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is just knowing yourself, which is hard until you've had those experiences and kind of started to parse out, well, what about this is not working for me? Is it the work? Is it the people I'm working with? Is it the work environment? It may be all of the above, but there are probably some things that bother you more than others. And I think the faster that you can start to sort of figure out what those things are and avoid them, the happier you're going to be. I mean, unfortunately for me, one of the things that apparently my personality type is driven the most insane by is having to bill hours. So, once I read this at some point, I was like, oh, wait, probably this big law environment where everything is accounted for in 6-minute increments is not really sustainable for me. So
yeah, that's kind of the basis.
Right, but it doesn't sound that bad. You just track your time, but there's certain personality types where like that idea is really bothersome to you. It's just not something you do naturally. Like I'm always late. Like I'm not really time focused. And so I had no idea that would actually end up being like a really serious roadblock to my happiness working at a firm job.
I mean, I also think that you can sort of think of your career, on this like longer path. And so sometimes you just need to get the job at the beginning.
Right, exactly.
I still think it's worth thinking about where you want to go because all of this can lead you somewhere. So I also think people shouldn't be discouraged if they end up with, not the ideal job at first, but they just need a job.
Yeah.
And so I think what we're talking about is sort of thinking ahead to, where do you want to end up? What environment is best? What, type of work, all of it.
Well, and I think too, whatever job you do end up with, really getting the most out of that. What can you learn from this? Like maybe it's not what you wanted exactly, but what can you get out of this? What relationships can you build? What can you learn about what you like or don't like? Those are the things that you can always take with you. And I think you can learn something from literally any job. I mean, I've never had a job where I didn't get something out of it, even when I was working as a barista or lifeguard or babysitter or any of those things.
Definitely. I think that's where mindset comes in too, right?
Yeah.
Like, how are you thinking about it? because just like you said, there's nothing where you're not going to learn something. And you want to be able to spin that into a story that makes sense for future jobs.
So you can have your private notes
going in.
Yeah, have your private notes to yourself of like, I have learned something about what does not work for me, perhaps in the workplace. But, again, like, when you're in your next interview, probably you don't want to badmouth whoever you worked for. So you got to come up with something where it's like, well, it was a really challenging environment. I learned a lot about operating with multiple deadlines. Fine.
Yeah.
Like that sounds like, oh yeah.
Different personality types.
Yeah. Managing a bunch of different personality types in a high, fast paced environment. Like people kind of understand what you're saying there. You had a terrible boss and too much work to do, but you said it nicely.
And I think it says a lot if you come out of a situation like that. So.
Yeah, totally. All right. Well, any final thoughts for people on this? We're unfortunately about out of time.
Well, my final thoughts are we're heading into the holidays. And so it's a good time to start this process if, you haven't yet, because maybe you'll have a little bit of extra time.
Right. You can even go to the library, in your hometown, check out these books. You don't even have to buy them. I walked past the library today and was like, wow, right, the library. I can stop purchasing books and just come here.
Definitely.
So yeah, get yourself some nice books, read them over Christmas and New Year's, and maybe you'll have a whole fresh perspective by the time January rolls around.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of come back at it and feel like you're, starting new.
Absolutely. Well, with that, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, including figuring out your life, check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.